All right, we're starting to have some more people trickle in. I'm going to go ahead and just start jumping into the presentation. For those of you who have joined the call within the last couple minutes, participants are not going to be able to use their microphones or cameras. We will be recording this conference and we'll make sure that it is available on our YouTube channel, probably later today after the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself. This is Ben Evans speaking, or any of the other panelists today on LinkedIn or via email. So we'll go ahead and jump in. I'll be kind of leading the discussion, but also leaning on Luke and Bridget. We'll do some introductions in a minute. First, wanted to make sure I cover really what the purpose of the webinar is today. So the purpose of today's webinar isn't to talk about Auditing Solutions and its specific offerings. What we're looking to do is almost have a state of the union discussion in the world of retail recovery auditing, talking about what we're seeing with our clients as we talk with other competitors in the industry and as we talk to prospective clients in this retail recovery auditing space. I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the next slide. We probably anticipate the meeting will take about 30 to 45 minutes, but we'll go through on the agenda. We'll go through a quick introduction for myself and for our other panelists today. We'll go through an executive summary of what we're seeing in the retail space, in the recovery audit world, and then talk about really the three focuses of change that we're seeing in this space, which is contract compliance auditing, the changes we're seeing in audit process optimization, and the changes we're seeing in the utilization of software tools. So with that, I'll go ahead and give myself a quick introduction and then allow Bridget and Luke to introduce themselves as well. So my name is Ben Evans. I'm the president of Auditing Solutions. I have been in the recovery audit space for about a decade now. Prior to doing recovery audit work, I worked in forensic accounting. So I'm a CPA by trade initially, and have really come up in the recovery audit world, really the retail recovery audit world in the contract compliance space. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I have, on a personal note, married and have three cute little girls, 13, 11, and a 4-year-old, and live out here in Gilbert, Arizona, where Auditing is headquartered. Bridget, would you like to give a quick introduction?
Yes. Hi, good morning. I'm Bridget Stamp. I'm a managing director at Audit Tech over the AP Recovery Auditing. And I've been in this space for about 25 years. So I guess my background is also in recovery auditing. I've specialized in retail. I've, seen a lot of changes over time with this industry, and it's something that I love doing and I love being a part of. I also live in the Phoenix Valley in Tempe, Arizona, which is not far from Gilbert. We're just opposite ends of the suburbs, and I'm happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Bridget. Luke, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Ben. My name is Luke Green. I'm the COO here at Auditing Solutions currently. I've been in the retail and commercial audit space my whole career, starting in '98, so close to 24 years now. Seen a lot during that time, hundreds of clients I've had the opportunity to work with, both across retail, grocery, and commercial, and I've watched the evolution during that time. And we're in a great place now and exciting new opportunities. So.
Great. Yeah, and just to kind of promote Bridget and Luke more than maybe they'll promote themselves. I've worked with Bridget and Luke for just over 4 years now. But their experience specifically in this retail recovery audit space is there's nothing better in the industry. I mean, they've worked with companies, large big box retailers like Walmart, and they've worked with $1-2 billion a year revenue accounts, and have done so for, as they said, over 2 decades. So while I'll have a lot to say around the contract compliance space, I think Bridget and Luke have really seen the evolution of I've seen the evolution of the retail recovery audit process firsthand, front row seat. Okay, well, I will jump on in. I'm going to cover the first topic here. Well, first the executive summary and the first topic. So at a high level, what are we seeing in the retail recovery audit space? So every presentation and webinar you're going to these days is probably referencing the pandemic because it's affected everything. Prior to the pandemic, retail recovery auditing was already seeing a significant amount of change taking place. And as with so many other things, once the pandemic hit and workforces shifted to home, and there was a big reshuffle where many people left their roles and entered other roles, all it did was speed up that change. So we've seen kind of a massive disruption in the status quo on how retail recovery audits are being handled at retailers and how third-party firms are supporting those new initiatives. The big shifts that we've seen prior to the pandemic that have been sped up after the pandemic, I guess we're still in the pandemic, are going to be focused in three real areas. One is looking at non-merchandise suppliers using contract compliance. The other is looking at process improvements, process adjustments. And then the third area is the use of software tools, both by third-party audit firms, which has been happening for decades, but really bringing those software tools into the environments of the retailers has seen a significant increase in the last couple of years, but was already changing quite rapidly prior to the pandemic. So we're going to cover each one of those topics. As I said before, I'm going to start off talking about the contract compliance auditing change that we've seen. So retailers, from my experience, I'd say retailers really started looking at contract compliance auditing probably about 7 to 10 years ago. And it's grown to where a majority of large retailers are looking to perform this work. So historically, in the retail recovery audit world, things were really focused on merchandise spend, what was actually coming in, going onto the shelves. Contract compliance auditing is a way for retailers to look at their non-merchandise spend, which typically has less standardized contracts and more complexity, and be able to identify instances in which there are potential overbillings and opportunities for recoveries in those spaces as well. So a contract compliance audit is an engagement that's focusing on your non-merchandise billings and trying to determine whether or not that those billings are consistent with contractual terms. So MSAs, amendments, addendums, etc. There's really a 3-phase process in the contract compliance process. So where a merchandise audit is focused on looking at typically close to the entire universe of merchandise spend and suppliers, a contract compliance audit is a deeper dive on a very limited number of suppliers at a specific time. So the first phase you see on the bottom right of the screen is going to be the supplier selection phase. So in these contract compliance audits, retailers are working either internally or with a third-party firm to identify suppliers that would make good candidates for a contract compliance audit. We'll talk about so the things that would really kind of help a retailer to determine that a candidate is a good candidate would be the complexity in the contract. So typically we're seeing service-based suppliers. We will have a list on the following slide of what some of those are, but both the third-party firm and the retailer work closely together to determine what a good list would be. And ultimately the retailer will send out a audit notification to these suppliers to be able to ask them to be able to notify them that an audit will be taking place. Once they've seen that audit notification, the third-party firm will reach out directly to that supplier and schedule initial kickoff call. And that's really where we see that contract compliance review phase open up. So in the second phase of a contract compliance project, the auditors will look to do a deep dive on a very limited number of transactions, and they work directly with suppliers in this case. So where a retail merchandise audit is typically going to focus on using clients' data to be able to write claims, a contract compliance audit is going to focus on using the actual supplier data. So, having done this work for a decade now, after I get into a kickoff call with the supplier, immediately I'm sending out a data request to that supplier, asking for some basic data, things like contract documents, a line item billing detail report, and aging of accounts receivable right off the bat. When I then, as a contract compliance auditor, when I then receive that data back from the supplier, I build out a risk plan based on what's in their contract and the data I have, and then I start to request from the supplier supporting documentation. So a good case study to make this a little bit more real world would be, let's say that you're a retailer and you have a supplier that performs HVAC maintenance. So they come in and they work on your air conditioning systems at your retail locations. If you decide to kick off an audit with them, as an auditor, as a contract compliance auditor, I'm going to reach out, get that initial data set, and then start requesting third-party documentation to confirm they're billing correctly. So often in a facility space, for example, so when we're talking about a HVAC vendor, they might have a provision that says they're supposed to bill their client cost plus 15%. Well, in those instances, as a contract compliance auditor, I would actually request their third-party cost data for those materials and then confirm that they are billing cost plus 15%. In instances where it appears that they aren't, I would look to have a discussion directly with that supplier to try to understand why there's a variance and whether or not it's an error or it's explained by some other factor. That's really that contract compliance review phase. And this is, again, a unique delivery model, or different than what we're seeing in the merchandise space because of how much interaction is having to take place with the supplier. After that review phase, the contract compliance auditors will really make one of three determinations. One would be, hey, things are looking pretty good here. They seem to be billing in line with the contractual terms. We recommend closing this engagement. In that case, there would be no phase three. The other two would be having a full scope audit. We've seen enough errors or signs of errors, smoke, if you will, that we are going to recommend auditing everything. The third and the most common is probably a limited scope audit. So the auditors will come back and say, hey, we've looked at specific categories. Going back to my example of an HVAC supplier, I might look at their labor and say, and they're billing labor perfectly. They're correctly accounting for hours. They are rounding correctly, etc. I may look at their fees and say they're billing fees correctly. When there's a usage fee for specific types of equipment, that's being billed accurately. But in that material space where they're supposed to be billing cost plus 15%, I've seen some variances that can't really be explained by anything other than an error. In that instance, the third-party audit firm that's performing the work will generally recommend a limited scope audit just in the area where the errors are taking place. So that's really the three-phase approach that is happening in these contract compliance audits. The big trend here, obviously, is just that retailers are finding an opportunity here to drive more recoveries in this space because it hasn't been looked at in the past, and obviously look to drive more improvement, more process improvement, to close gaps in this area of non-merchandise spend. I do have a quick list here of some of the common categories for contract compliance audits that we focus in for retailers. It can be pretty much any non-merchandise supplier, but these are some of the more common categories. Construction suppliers, facilities management, an HVAC example I just went through is facilities management. Temporary staffing relationships, especially instances in which a retailer is using a MSP, a managed service provider. Store fixtures, and then fleet services, whether vehicles are being purchased or capital leases are taking place. And a pro tip on these contract compliance audits, you know, as a retailer, if you are looking to perform this work, either internally or bringing in an external firm, really focus on contract complexity. The best candidates for a contract compliance audit are the relationships that have the most complex contract language, because it's difficult to deliver on complexity. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which I believe I'll hand off the discussion to Bridget to talk about some of the audit process optimization that we're seeing in the industry right now.
Hi, thank you, Ben. So this recovery auditing industry has really been around since the 70s. And during that time, there haven't really been any periods of stagnant or complacency. It's been changing. It's constantly changing, with retailers wanting those recovery dollars, wanting to maximize the recovery dollars, but also mitigate vendor friction to get those dollars. So, you know, they're looking to optimize processes in order to make that happen. One of the first areas is accelerating the audits. So instead of, you know, 2 or 3 years after the fact, having a review take place, or if it was a team that had, or excuse me, a company that had an internal team and an external first pass and second pass teams, it could take up to 3 or 4 years to have those take place. So that we're seeing changes and focusing on having those timelines accelerated and moving up to be more of a 2-year review, or even sometimes a single year. This is driven a lot by merchant groups. You know, they're focused on planning for the future. And when you're asking them to provide documents or insight for things that happened up to 4 years prior, that's a really large time burden for them. In some cases, the desks may have changed hands. It's not the person who made the deal is no longer there. You know, the current person doesn't have access to the old information. And again, they're focused on the future, not the past. So we're also seeing where, you know, vendors believed that the requests for old documentation were unreasonable, and they would resort sometimes to credit freezes or withholding shipments as leverage to get claims waived. So retailers wouldn't always see those recoveries, and, you know, it would cause friction in the vendor relationships. We've also seen financial leadership within retailers wanting to accelerate this, to be able to recognize that revenue more quickly. You know, it's worth more the more you can get that in. So in response, we're seeing a lot of these timelines accelerated, so that goals are being set to be no more than a single year behind the year that just concluded. So when everything's in place, you can start an audit quickly and then get it done within a year. If there's a second pass, sometimes that is 18 months that they're giving for it. So when the process is really well organized and managed, we're seeing some companies that are allowing 18 months for 3 reviews. And that would be the internal team and 2 external teams performing consecutive reviews. So that's a pretty big acceleration from where it used to be. So, and it's also trending towards trying to facilitate reviews of transactions much closer to real time, maybe monthly or quarterly when that's possible. And some of this is happening through, some of the acceleration is made possible through standardized audit guidelines or guardrails. So this is, you know, expectations for all groups involved about how these programs work. So merchants can understand why audit claims are being generated and how, instead of feeling as though the rules might change with each claim. Vendors might have an expectation of what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to perform. Each audit group involved is working within the same expectations. Nobody's making up their own rules. And they can be really specific about how, a step-by-step process of how things are executed, or much more generalized about ideas of the expectations of the vendors and how things work within the retail organization. And those are generated oftentimes in collaboration with all groups, offering input, what works best, how can the timelines be accelerated, the guardrails be put in place, and still maximize those recovery dollars. We're seeing changes in expectations within the client for cross-departmental collaboration. So regular conversations are happening between accounting and merchandising. Merchants are responsible for working with the vendors to secure and negotiate that funding, but the responsibility for collecting those funds is often with accounting. So when those two groups are operating within silos and there's not a lot of communication, the expectation that's put in place may not be the expectation that's understood for collecting. So having the teams work together and collaborate helps everyone have a better understanding of what those expectations for those programs are, for those vendor incentive programs. And the vendors also really only have to have one set of rules to abide by. We're seeing also, instead of audit teams being more generalized knowledge, we're seeing the formation of specialized teams. And this is, it can be, it doesn't have to be within an audit team. It can be within a department. Like I said, accounting collects the funding, merchandising often secures the funding. So we're seeing sometimes the formation of teams within the merchandising department that are responsible for working with the vendors to make sure those incentive funds are collected. And also within internal audit teams, we're seeing where it will be broken into smaller teams that will learn the ins and outs of a specific area. They might learn traffic, how all that transportation is supposed to work, how all that freight moves. They might learn all of the accounting rules and how the system works, and really where the potential for errors is. And they might be more focused on merchandising and even working with the merchandising team to focus on real-time collection of this stuff. So a lot of those specialized teams can also work much more specifically on root cause analysis. They're really able to identify much more complex patterns of leakage than a general audit person would. They can understand the pieces of the data. They can get into how those systems work, how the negotiations happen, what the expectation is, and work through all of those pieces to see where the system might fail or where the controls might be weak. They'll be able to identify those patterns or specific scenarios that allow that to happen. And from there, reporting with actionable recommendations can take place, especially from the external audit partners. And though that root cause analysis and all of the reporting can really lead into the single biggest want that we see from organizations is audit compression. And that's not just, compression is not just understanding and, making a half-hearted effort to say, yeah, let's stop this from happening. It's a real focus on preventing the leakage from happening. So recovery money is nice. In most cases, it's a budget line item, but not allowing that revenue loss in the first place is the ultimate goal of audit compression. So when you're seeing the same types of claims identified and recovered year over year, there's likely a repeatable pattern that exists. And that means that there is a real opportunity to compress the audit. So compressing the audit is teams working together to identify the causes, to look at what's happening again and again and again, and focus on stopping that from happening. So a team that has action plan with goals, expectations, measurable results, and accountability. And that can be done through a partnership with your external audit team or your internal teams.
Great. And I'm just going to acknowledge late night editing on a laptop is why you have 2 T's on the. So I apologize for that, but Bridget's focus here on that overall audit compression, I want to drive that point home pretty hard. In our discussions with existing clients and prospective clients in the retail space, this is what everyone's talking about. We've been, again, speaking as these retailers, we've been performing this audit work for 20, 30, 40, in some cases close to 50 years. And there are still certain claim types that are being written every single year. We want to see that shrink down because it's getting fixed, right? The process improvement. And Luke is about to talk about some software tools that help in that process. But really, what we're also seeing is an expectation, and just reiterating Bridget's point here, an expectation by retailers that their audit firm is dedicated to doing that as well, which is a challenge in this space. Most retail recovery audit firms, if not all, are contingent and they work on commission. So their natural incentive is not to shrink the recovered dollars year over year. And so it's something that there's kind of a push and pull between retailers and their third-party audit firms. But ultimately the client's right, and retail recovery audit firms are needing to find real, actionable, significant ways to help clients compress their audit, compress their recoveries through actually resolving errors, making sure they don't occur in the first place, or at least helping the client to pick up those errors prior to a third-party audit firm looking at the spend. Okay. Anything else on this one, Bridget, before we move on to the discussion that Luke will lead?
No, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Let me move the next slide here. And Luke's going to walk us through some software tools. I actually have an animated graphic on this one. I was pretty impressed with myself on that.
That is nice, Ben. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah.
As I mentioned in the introductions, I've seen a lot over the last 25 years in the retail audit space or recovery audit space. When I first started, the use of software by outside audit firms was, kind of in its infancy, just kind of getting off the ground with the collection of data and its usage. There was still a high number of paper documents, and for a lot of years starting out, there was a lot of digging through boxes and highlighting specific records and doing things in a very manual way. And that's really shifted over the last 25 years to where we're at today, in the real concentration on using specialized software to perform recovery audit work, and a space where almost all transactions are in some form digital. So, tools now are taking full advantage of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there have been specialized tools created. And I'll kind of talk about a transition, but recovery audit firms have been developing these tools and utilizing these tools now for 10-20 years and beyond. Some of those tools have been successful and some have not, but we've really transitioned into a position where those tools that were historically being used by outside recovery audit firms are now being sold and used by internal audit at specific retailers. So it kind of leads me into the two different methodologies as it relates to recovery auditing at retailers, and that is, number one, a retailer that has a recovery audit program that does include an internal group. So, a retailer may have a group of people in their own organization that perform a recovery audit after accounting has taken, first stab at collecting dollars. That can be a larger group, it can be just a couple people, but, if there's an internal group in place, obviously, these software tools can be utilized to the full extent to really optimize what that internal group is doing. If there is no internal group, or if a retailer has made a decision to not really have an internal group, but just have maybe their regular accounting group manage outside firms, these software tools can still be utilized, just at maybe a smaller level, or less optimization. So, these tools can really be utilized no matter which direction that retailer has decided to go. And I'll just go through, a handful of what we've seen in the way of what those tools are and how they've been used and by whom. So, historically, outside audit firms have created their own software tools to analyze data from clients and identify errors and pursue claims. Those have always been specialized, but now there's additional pieces beyond that can be shared more readily with clients and their internal teams. Tools, and over the last decade, one of the things that's really become a big part of almost every retail audit is the auditing of email communication between merchants and vendors. Where historically agreements were manual, kept at individual merchants' desks and file cabinets, over the last decade or so, that's really transitioned to a scenario where those agreements and that communication, as opposed to being done over the phone, is really all email based. So the negotiation, everything from the negotiation of a specific vendor's program to the final documentation of an agreement is usually in email and is, in that email communication stream. So the ability to really utilize that email data, that being the email body itself, as well as the attachments in whatever format they are found, has really become a much bigger aspect of what retail recovering is. And any successful retail audit really should include an analyzation of what those emails are and what they contain and what those specific agreements are. As we know, we're really looking for the needle in the haystack as auditors. And, until you have all the pieces that outline what a program is and can bump that up against what actually happened, which is what the data tells you, without knowing what it is, it's really hard to identify those problems. So email auditing tools were initially created for outside recovery firms or by them to perform that task. And over the last, probably 5 years specifically, I've seen instances where those tools have been offered up and they've started to be tools that are utilized by internal audit teams at specific retailers. So, they, just as with every other audit category and area, an internal team can really have all the tools at their disposal that an outside firm has. and can dig up all the same agreement information and really put an accurate picture around what a program looks like before they compare it to the details of what occurred. So email auditing tools have really taken a big step up over the last 10 years, and specifically within the retail internal audit environment within the last 5. And I expect that to just accelerate. So email auditing and a lot of these tools really help us identify situations where there can be more real-time or prepayment auditing as well. So as it relates to real-time and prepayment audit tools, Bridget mentioned something when she was talking about closer to current, and that was clients that can identify specific claim categories that they can move forward, and in some cases really review on a completely different timeline than the rest of their audit. So, examples of that could be, payment errors of different types or erroneous payments of different types, whether it be duplicate payments or, payments to incorrect vendors. In some cases, those can even be identified before payment occurs, so prepayment. There are various other categories that can be looked at much more real time, and in some cases it's important that they're looked at more real time. They could be areas where we're really just penalizing specific vendors for certain issues, and it makes more sense for those penalties to occur more real time instead of an accumulation of those penalties over an entire year or 2 years worth of spend. If those penalties are there, kind of as an incentive to keep those vendors in line in certain areas, clients usually would prefer that they be applied more real time as opposed to an accumulation where you're going back and applying those for a full year's worth of problems. Another area where we're seeing tools really utilized is by clients that have and this one really relates to clients that have full AP audit internal, staff to conduct almost a full scale AP audit, to those that just have a couple people that have a few extra minutes every day, or, a couple extra hours every week. And that's tools that are really concentrated on capturing something that in the recovery audit space, we refer to as low hanging fruit. So the recoveries that are really easily identifiable or more easily identifiable and are able to be recognized more easily. So there are tools out there that really allow and help internal audit firms, as well as, maybe just an accounting clerk that has a few extra hours a week, look at different transactions that are spit out from one of these tools to find those easily recoverable dollars. Those again are more simple accounting errors like duplicate payments or erroneous payments of some kind, open statement credits, a statement review or a reconciliation of everything that's open and outstanding at a specific vendor is pretty easy once that documentation is received. And it's just, the process to get that in the door, is really a little bit more cumbersome. So there are tools that simplify that process and can really be taken advantage of by groups that really don't have a whole lot of time and energy to spend on a full-blown internal retail audit. So those have been used a lot more, and especially on the smaller side of retail and in the commercial space, those tools are really attractive because they don't necessarily have the time and resources to do a full-blown internal AP audit review. Next area is vendor master tool development. So this has really been a transition, and what I've seen over the last 10 years or so, from instances where this vendor master reconciliation or more of a cleanup is done kind of case by case, one off. So if a client or a retailer's vendor master is really gotten out of control, if they've acquired other companies and integrated a lot of new vendors or attempted to integrate a lot of new vendors, that vendor master that they maintain oftentimes just gets really messy. They get the same vendor entered multiple times, which causes, all kinds of issues in relation to invoices being paid multiple times or erroneous payments of different kinds. So, historically, that was more of a one-off cleanup where those duplicate vendors were identified and cleaned out. Over the last 5 years or so, we've seen a lot more scenarios where that's been taken to kind of the next step, which is really where, a software tool can be utilized to really maintain a vendor portal. And in that vendor portal, the vendors have access to that to a certain degree, and they can update their own information. They can help make sure that that information is accurate, address, phone numbers, contact names, email addresses, that information being accurate really helps everybody involved in a recovery audit. And if those vendors have the opportunity to update it themselves with current and accurate information, everybody's jobs become that much easier and fewer errors take place. There's even beyond that, inside that vendor portal, there's scoring systems that are being used to really identify what vendors are brought in certain areas and which ones, may be having issues. So the complexity of what that vendor master looks like in the portal that's utilized to review those vendors and make sure that the information is accurate and that the right vendors are being worked with is been something that is really come on strong lately and is starting to be utilized instead of just the one-on-one cleanup. And then finally, document repository tools. So in the recovery audit space, we're certainly all familiar with situations where contracts and agreements and the pieces of information we utilize to accurately put together what a program is, in a lot of cases, have been scattered and, may be in email. They may be in a file cabinet that a merchant keeps himself at his desk or, in his office somewhere. They may reside in other places, but the document repository tools are really being utilized to help bring all of that information into the same spot and to make sure it's in a consistent format and electronic format specifically. So it's taking a lot of what may have been hard copy documents and scanning them and including them. It's creating a historical record of what those agreements looked like. So, we're not just looking at the newest version of a specific record, but its full history over time. And to perform an accurate audit, obviously, it's that historical record that allows us to see how the program has evolved specifically through the audit time period, is a very, very important factor. That's why, when we look at a vendor master and we see that, a vendor is set up with specific, say, payment terms, those are current. There's traditionally no historic record that shows, the evolution of maybe that vendor's payment terms over the last, decade or even a few years that include the audit time period. So it's important that that historical information is captured and is organized and is easily accessible by not only the recovery audit folks, but the merchants themselves as they enter into new negotiations, etc. So overall, software has become a much bigger component of recovery audit in relation to what outside audit firms have been creating. And, as technology's improved and, and the usage of large data sets, specifically on retailers, has become a lot easier and, more realistic. A lot of the specific tables in a retail environment that we deal with on a regular basis are, not millions of records, they're billions of records in size. And, today there are very efficient software tools that allow us to utilize a full breadth of that information and accurately query on it and utilize it in a way to identify those needles in the haystack that we're looking for. And, I'm excited to see where things go, with the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, these processes, that outside audit firms use, as well as internal groups use, just become more accurate, more real time, and, allow for us as outside auditors to really help retail clients drive process improvement. That's one of the things, as Bridget mentioned, we hear from a lot of our clients is that they want to realize some process improvement. They want to see that they're fixing some of these things, and they want to, put some tangible numbers around that. So software is a big driving component to make that happen.
Great. Thanks, Luke. Yeah. So just kind of moving towards the end of the presentation and discussion here. As I said, starting off the discussion, really wanted this to be more of a state of the union on retail recovery auditing, so that those who are listening to this call either in real time or who are looking to, watch this presentation in the future, if there are specific components that kind of pique your interest on your own retail recovery audit that you think you'd like to learn more information on, please, feel free to reach out to myself or Luke or Bridget. We'd be happy to kind of walk you through more details in any of these components and how the development in that component could help to grow your audit. So we'll have this up to the YouTube channel probably in the next 24 to 48 hours. We appreciate everybody who has participated as an attendee today, and wish you a great week. Thanks. Bye.